Good evening, this is After the Revolution, a review of architecture's massive consequences. Tonight we have a new guest in the person of Chris Cutrone. Hello.
Hello.
So Chris Cutrone is a college educator, writer and media artist committed to critical thinking and artistic practice and the politics of social emancipation. Chris Cutrone is an adjunct assistant professor in the departments of art history, theory and criticism, and visual and critical studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and is a lecturer in the social sciences collegiate division at the University of Chicago, where he completed the PhD in the comedy on the history of culture and MA in art history. He received the MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the BA from Hampshire College. His doctoral dissertation is on Adorno's Marxism. Chris Cutrone is the original lead organizer of Platypus Affiliated Society.
Platypus.
Platypus. Mm-hmm. From 1989 to 1992, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Gulf War, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the Los Angeles riots and the election of Bill Clinton, Cutrone was a youth member of the Spartacist League, U.S. section of the International Communist League, Fourth Internationalist, upholding the revolutionary socialist tradition of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, and the October Revolution of 1917. Chris Cutrone is also the editor of the blog The Last Marxist. So, there's a lot of questions I would like to ask you. I will invite people from both the right and the left in this TV show. And the first thing is, this TV show is entitled After the Revolution and works from the assumption that there has been a revolution, but that against all fears, this revolution was not led by the proletariat, but by the capital. Meaning that revolutions are possible. I believe we've been hit by one of Marxist proportions, I would say. And we went from, for example, we went from a ratio of 1 to 30 to 1 to 350 between high and low wages in 30 years. Mm. So would you agree with this statement? And if yes or if no, what the hell happened?
I do think that there has been a significant transformation of the world in the last generation, over the last 40 years. And certainly it has been led by the right, by neoliberalism. And I would say that it responded to a crisis in the 1960s and 1970s that was simultaneously economic, political, cultural, and social, and was first expressed by the New Left, but then taken over by the neoliberal right.
What is the New Left?
The New Left was the upsurge in the 1960s. That came, it had a few different sources. One major source was the crisis of official communism in 1956 when Khrushchev denounced Stalin. And also the Soviet Union and Communist China split. So you had a split between Mao and Khrushchev. It also was that same year, there was an uprising in Hungary in response to that liberalization. And there was also an attempt to liberalize the states of Eastern Europe in other parts of Eastern Europe, such as Poland. But it was clamped down, of course. The Soviet Union invaded Hungary to put it down. There was also that year the meeting of the non-aligned movement in Bandung in Indonesia, where the third world, the post-colonial world, asserted that it was going to follow neither the East nor the West. Okay. And so that meant that the left, as it had been defined in the previous generation, mostly through Soviet communism, came into crisis, and that opened an opportunity for a new left.
Okay.
In the United States, the Democratic Party experienced the ruling Democratic Party, which had been the majority party since the New Deal of FDR in the 1930s, experienced a crisis, a combined crisis, first with the Civil Rights Movement, and then with the Vietnam War. And I think that all of these things produced a new turn on the left in the 1960s, whose consequences we still live with. And expressed also a discontent and crisis with the form of capitalism in the mid-20th century, what people refer to as Fordist capitalism. the kind of organized capitalism, the state-organized capitalism that integrated the working class with the state. So you had the cooperation of the unions with the state developmental projects. And that was true not only in the metropolitan world, but also in the post-colonial world. And all of that came into crisis. That's why around 1968 you saw uprisings not only in France and the United States, but also in Mexico and Pakistan and other places.
Okay. And so, for instance, I raised a red flag here, which you saw. It's a big red flag. And this flag for me does not stand for communist or socialist references, but I'm trying to catch back to what I understand as being its origin, meaning the flag of the people, the flag of the blood of the people. And after McCarthyism, I thought with coming with this flag that I would get in trouble a bit about its, communist associations or whatever, but, the first fear was about gangs, actually, or,
That it was a gang symbol.
Yeah, people thought it was a gang symbol. So, it could be understood as a gang, but not the ones that we actually are experiencing now here. And so it seems that socialism or communism have disappeared from people's minds around here. Whereas if I understand correctly, there has been a very strong tradition of left-wing radical ideas in Chicago, lots of unions. And could you give me a broad picture of what happened with the leftist organization, both in, let's say, in the US and more specifically in Chicago since McCarthyism?
Well, I'd go back to an earlier history, which is, of course, the Haymarket strike.
So can you restate what happened at the Haymarket?
This was a working class movement for the 8-hour day or the 40-hour week, really the 8-hour day, and which was a radical demand at the time, back in the late 19th century. And there was a confrontation and a violence between the police and the protesters, in which both protesters and police officers were killed. And in fact, May 1st, May Day, commemorates that incident.
You mean nationwide?
Globally.
Oh, globally.
Yeah, May 1st was a holiday instituted by the Second International, the Socialist International, in the late 19th century, and it commemorated the Haymarket massacre of the workers.
How many people
Not very many people, but enough. Just a handful of police and a handful of protesters, but it was a flashpoint and also signaled something new, certainly in terms of American history. It was discontent with post-Civil War industrialization in the United States. And so that took place here in Chicago. So that's, in a sense, the deep history of working class radicalism in the United States. Later, Chicago was a center of the Communist Party
for the
United
US.
States.
For the US.
Yes, for the United States. And even today, one of the larger socialist organizations, the International Socialist Organization, has its headquarters here in Chicago. And there are other left groups that also have their headquarters here. For the same historical reasons. So Chicago and New York, San Francisco also have been historically hotbeds of radicalism. With respect to McCarthyism, McCarthyism, of course, was a phenomenon of the Cold War. It was an attempt to purge leftists from the government and also from unions after World War II, because leftists, communists, including official communists, participated in the war against fascism during World War II, and so participated in the U.S. administration during World War II. And McCarthyism was an attempt to purge those people after World War II. And that put a chill on things in the United States. It certainly kind of chased away a lot of fellow travelers, a lot of people sympathetic to the Communist Party but not actually party members in the 1950s. The party was in decline anyway after World War II.
For what reason?
Well, I think that there was a change in the way the working class was organized. So the Communist Party had been involved a great deal in the 1930s with a new upsurge of working class organization in the Congress of Industrial Unions, the CIO, which was in opposition to the more conservative craft unions, the American Federation of Labor. So the AFL and the CIO were in competition, but after World War II they united, so that's why we have the AFL-CIO now combined. And so there was a decline in labor radicalism, and that decline in labor radicalism marginalized the left, marginalized the communist left among the working class.
So it would be internal dissensions that would have fragilized it. And you would say that this is mainly we're still mainly in the outcome of this internal.
Yes, conservatization of the labor movement, but also, of course, the AFL-CIO participated in the Cold War. And so they not only lost communist membership, but they became active anti-communist organizations. So the AFL-CIO, for instance, participated in U.S. government efforts to organize workers around the world, especially in the post-colonial world, in opposition to communist-led unions. So there was actually a phrase used at the time called the AFL-CIA, to play on the AFL-CIO. And so you had kind of Cold War liberalism, Cold War social democracy, steering the labor movement into an arm of the U.S. state in the Cold War context. Although that started to break down in the 60s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, regarding African Americans, was this radical left, going through racial barriers, or was it? How did that work play out?
It came up against racial barriers, and so the CIO, as opposed to the AFL, was historically more open to and more inclusive of black workers. Because this is industrial union organizing, so that means organizing everyone at a factory, everyone in an industry, so the same union in different companies but in the same industry. So for instance, the UAW is a good example of this, United Auto Workers.
Okay.
And so what that meant was, rather than organizing people based on their skills or by their trade, where in a single factory you'd have multiple unions among the workers, the CIO organized all the workers together, and that meant including unskilled workers, which meant including black workers. So the CIO was more inclusive, and therefore laid the groundwork, because the historic CIO unions were actually the ones that were supportive of the civil rights movement after World War II. Yeah.
And so, because I'm always very... so the reason why I'm asking all this is because I believe that this is architecture. The capacity of people to organize, and much more than the production of buildings per se. And I'm always fascinated by how at some point people could be organized and then they're not.
Yeah. Why that might change.
Yeah, how because suddenly you would have unions, or you would have infrastructures, you would have solid, teamwork, you would have and so these internal dissensions, conflicts would have led to this disaffection of organizations. Is that what happened, or were there other factors? Or?
I think that the way that I usually think about this is that unions, of course, for instance, are very much about the way capitalism is organized at a certain moment in history, not only in terms of the way firms or the workplace is organized, but also in terms of the way society is organized. So something like family structure or like neighborhood dynamics factor a great deal in the way workers are organized. And so what you have over the course of the last 150 years is significant, substantial changes in working class organization. So what we had was a form of working class organizing that was appropriate to a certain moment that has not adequately transformed itself to match changing patterns in the way people live, as well as the way capitalism is organized, the way production is organized, and the way capitalism is financially organized, for example. So changes in productions, changes in workplace organization, but also changing living patterns affected the working class organizations. And since the neoliberal turn, the unions that had previously been bulwarks of working class organization.
What's bulwarks?
Sort of what you would call an edifice.
Okay.
Indeed, structures have been on the defensive. And so rather than struggling to challenge capitalism and struggling to reorganize the workplace according to the workers' interests, they've been defensive and trying to protect the workers' interest against the changes of capitalism. So in fact, they've been forced into a conservative position. Yeah. And that's always disadvantageous.
Yeah. So it's going to make you a lot of friends by saying this.
It's widely acknowledged. Yeah.
Okay.
You know, people understand this.
Okay. Going on down my list. So in this exhibition, I claim that according to Bataille, architecture is the ideological ordering of reality. And as such, architecture is not as much to be found in the production of buildings per se, but rather in economic theories, mainly neoliberalism here. Do you believe that reality is designed according to ideological principles? And if so, do you think we can come up with the design of an alternative future as an intention?
I would say that it depends on the historical epoch that one is referring to. For instance, I think that what had been an essentially religious cosmology that had persisted for thousands of years in traditional civilization broke down and was dissolved by bourgeois revolution, by transformation in social relations after the Renaissance, but leading up to the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, the era of revolution. And again, one could see that religion expressed an ordered cosmos, a divine order, a great chain of being in Christian cosmology. But I think that rather than religion ordering reality, I think that religion tried to understand the way reality was ordered in terms of the way people had already practiced their social life. So the castes that existed, the aristocratic, the feudal lords, the knights, the warrior caste, and the clergy, the apostolic Christian tradition, the apostles of Jesus, they had their own organization, and the peasants, of course, had their own way of life. They had a kind of traditional subsistence agriculture that had carried on largely unchanged for a great deal of time. And I think that religion tried to make sense of that. In other words, rather than imposing an order on it, it tried to give a kind of divine sanction to it, to make sense of it. That's the way I understand theology. And for instance, the warrior caste, even though they're sanctified by the church, they are not designed by the church. Rather, the church regards them as...
accepts them as an existing force
and says, God has made these people to defend Christianity. And so I think that similarly, although with some substantial differences that I'll mention, in the modern world, ideology doesn't order reality so much as it tries to give a sense to the way reality has already been ordered in social practice.
So is that what you would say about neoliberalism?
Neoliberalism is complicated because, on the one hand, it's kind of a chicken or egg paradox. It's a cause and effect paradox. But I think that what's more important in regarding neoliberalism as ideology is what it set out to do versus how it actually played out in practice. And so I don't think that the world has been remade according to Milton Friedman's ideas. Rather, Milton Friedman's ideas intersected reality when reality was in crisis and in a process of change. And then his ideas helped steer that change, but ultimately the change affected his ideas at least as much as his ideas affected reality. And so the way I look at ideology, it's a question of plausibility. In other words, what made someone like Milton Friedman's ideas become plausible to people? What made them catch on at a certain moment in history? Because he had had the same ideas for a decade or more before they became popular. And he was sort of in the wilderness. No one was really listening to him.
He was sort of a buffoon too.
People ridiculed him. So the question is, why did his ideas catch on when they did? In other words, what role did his ideas play? How did they serve as an instrument? Rather than thinking that his ideas changed the world, they did play a role in the change of the world. They made sense of a change.
And this change, so where would you originate that change then?
It's a little bit of a mystery, because I do think that if you look at the discontents in the post-World War II order, there's a great many discontents. There's discontent in the United States with the racial regime, with Jim Crow segregation, that had been challenged by the needs of the war economy. So in World War II, blacks were integrated into the industrial working class out of necessity. So were women. And then after World War II, blacks and women did not want to go back to the roles that they played before World War II. And so the question was, how could the existing structures of politics, economics, culture, society accommodate those discontents, or not? So I see it in terms of discontents that had to be expressed, and that's expressed not only at the level of ideas, but at the level of changing practices, meaning people started to live a different way, and that created a challenge to the existing system. So you have a kind of old system coming up against new practices, and then people try to make sense of that. And ideology plays a crucial role there, because it both is a fermenting factor, but it also helps stabilize the change. In other words, it gives people a sense of the rationale for the change. It justifies the change.
But still, like, how would you... it seems like there's a strong pattern that a lot of people vote against their own interests. So... how because there were other ideas. So why would people choose ideas that would actually end up being against their own interest in terms of wage hour, wage paid hours or whatever? All those sort of. So how would you explain this?
Well, I would say that the concept of interest is complicated. On the one hand, economic interest is very powerful. On the other hand, people don't just pursue their economic interests. And so I'd say that there are other interests that can override economic interests. And so what you see in the post-Fordist world, in the post-1960s world, when people vote against their interest, they're voting against aspects of their interest in favor of other aspects of their interest. And so... this is described as the culture wars. In other words, how did the right gain the upper hand with the working class? They made a cultural appeal in which they flattered people in terms of their cultural identification rather than, and at the expense of, their economic interests in that respect. I wouldn't overstate that, but I'd say that that did play a part in it. And also the way economic interests had been defined in the previous regime no longer worked. And so it's not that people could continue to vote their interests in the way that they had. So they couldn't any longer simply vote with their unions, as the unions themselves were declining in membership and in the role that they played. And so, I would say that interest is a very complicated category. It's hard to say precisely how people express their political interests. But one thing that I would point to in particular is the historical dynamic, meaning that you have the old clashing against the new. And although there were new ideas bubbling up in the 1960s, in fact, you had a kind of clash of old ideas, meaning you had a clash of kind of Marxist socialist ideas against liberal ideas, old liberal ideas, classical liberal ideas. And people were discontented with the state. And so it seemed that liberal ideas appealed more than Marxist ideas, because the Marxist ideas seemed to be about enforcing the state, whereas liberal ideas spoke to people's discontent with the state. They felt that the state was already too powerful. And that goes across the spectrum, left and right.
Yeah, which is very, very, again, and I'm just a tourist here, I'm spending 3 months, and so I'm just trying to grasp whatever I can, but I have a long relationship with the US, but still, And so, for instance, one thing that is very intriguing to me is it seems that even in the left, there would be this praise of the individual instead of the common. Meaning, like, from my understanding, the most radical left today is more like people like Chomsky or anarcho-syndicalism, or and so that is a very strong difference from the background that I have as a French guy. So it seems like even like there's this. I would like the power of the individual. To me, for instance, from my background, would be very much associated with neoliberalism. Whereas in the US, it seems that there's still, like you could have anarcho-syndicalists that would still be pro-gun. How do you have anything to say about this, or like compared to the tension between this idea that a left would be based out of a sum of individuals more than the people as an entity? Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah, it does. What I would say is that I think it goes back to the 18th century. It goes back to the bourgeois revolution, both the English Revolution of the 17th and 18th century, and also the American Revolution as a continuation of that, but also the French Revolution. I think that what happened was that liberty, equality, and fraternity, capitalism separated these out. So I think that the bourgeois revolution understood itself as both individual and collective. In other words, it was for the emancipation of both the individual and the collective. It was a changed relationship between the individual and the collective, where previously the individual related to the collective through a caste identity. That broke down. And that went for workers as well. So the workers were guild craftsmen, and so they were part of a kind of corporate structure, an exclusive structure. They identified with the guild. Whereas liberalism, as a revolutionary ideology of the bourgeois revolution, was about really transforming and reorienting the relationship of the individual and the collective. But capitalism, which emerges in the 19th century, really drives the different values of the bourgeois revolution against each other, so that equality, liberty, and fraternity become opposed values rather than integral values, the way they were understood at the time. So in the 18th century, it would have been understood that a precondition of individual emancipation would be collective emancipation, and vice versa. A precondition for collective emancipation would be individual emancipation. Now we tend to treat these as a choice. You're either for the individual or you're for the collective. In fact, overcoming capitalism would be about emancipating both the individual and the collective. It would be about, again, transforming that relationship between the individual and the collective. Now, in capitalism, that relationship of individual and collective is mediated by capital. From a Marxist perspective, capital is the contradiction between wage labor and capital accumulation. And of course, wage labor is both individual and collective, meaning it's an individual labor contract that nonetheless is driven by collective forces, which is why workers...
Because it's also a massive phenomenon.
Which is why workers have to organize collectively. But that collective organization is meant to serve the individual. It's not meant to act against the individual. It's meant to serve the individual. Because after all, even when you have collective organizing of the working class, bourgeois freedom still remains, namely that you can quit your job. You can, go and work for someone else. You can change the job that you do. You can change your employer. You can break your labor contract. It's not as if joining a union means joining a medieval guild. Right? It's a very different phenomenon. So the way I understand socialism is that socialism is meant to be the pursuit of that same liberty, equality, fraternity, the same goals of the bourgeois revolution. However, those goals have now been contradicted and driven against each other in capitalism. So I understand capitalism as a contradictory phenomenon. In other words, not just as a negative phenomenon, but as a contradictory phenomenon that raises all those values, puts all those values into play again.
So there's someone you might, I don't know if you like him too, probably not, but the Zizek.
Zizek, uh-huh.
He was, for instance, stating that there could have been the assumption for a while that the expansion of capitalism was associated with freedom.
Mm-hmm.
But now the major forces of capitalism is China, and so that this
authoritarian capitalism.
Authoritarian capitalism, and so that we cannot but disclaim, and so that there's really an emergency to come up with an alternative. Because and so I guess that goes back to the second half of the question, which you haven't answered, about. Can the world be designed? You've explained it historically as the process through which we've gone is that it was more complex than this. It was not only Friedman echoed some sort of or resonated some sort of, but now we are here, and so every time I talk to and it's happened so often that must be true, but every time I talk to people. Sociologists, people in social sciences, things are more complex than they appear, or a lot of the revolutionary discourse from the left is associated with oversimplification, or Naomi Klein's book about the shock doctrine, or they're saying like basically this is conspiracy theory somehow. But on the other hand, I always come back to that same thing, can a change from 1 to 30 to 1 to 350 be not designed? This, in terms of class struggle, this is really, we've had it like real bad, So, and that goes, I guess, also to my last, one of the last questions I had written down here is that, if I understand correctly, for instance, Marx was arguing that the engine of history was not necessarily ideas, but class struggle. That was the engine of it. But then, what is the role of ideas in the engineering of reality? We talk a lot about social engineering, or there's a lot of devices that are, like even for the African American community, a lot of things were done so that they would be this or that way, and so
choices have been made with consequences.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly, and or as what's his name? That quote that I said earlier, Milton Friedman is the idea that Milton Friedman is the living proof that ideas have consequences. Yeah, that was Donald Rumsfeld.
Donald Rumsfeld,
saying this on
so they flatter themselves. Yeah. They flatter themselves.
So, but
ideas matter if my ideas matter. Right?
Yeah,
if it was someone else's ideas, then they would say ideas don't matter.
Okay. So that's the way to put it. But what hope? The thing is also another, to quote back again, to hit it from another angle. Another quote of Zizek is, he says like, I don't have the time to go vote every day.
Participatory democracy.
Yeah, I don't have time to go vote every day, and somehow, I get the feeling that the left does not seem to be very ambitious. It seems that to me the right is very ambitious. People like Milton Friedman say again, and we can temper down this a bit, but they have a revolutionary discourse. They say, I'm a radical. I want to go to the root of things. I get the feeling that my understanding of what's going on, especially in the U.S. of the left, as a tourist again, is that there's with this bottom-up dialogue, which is very much praised and very positive, of course, with has a lot of success. There's still the acknowledgement of the up as an entity, that you would come up with, that you would not allow yourself to come up with an alternative. Does that make sense?
Yes, I would say that a distinction that I'd make that's very important is between the left and the right, meaning that the right relies on the status quo. It relies on the power of the status
historically?
Quo. Even today, I would say that the right I would define as opportunistic. And again, serving to justify changes rather than being critical in the way that the left is. In other words, the left really tasks itself with thinking about what's possible in a way that doesn't have to compromise so much with the status quo. The right is really about compromise. It's really about curtailing freedom and saying, well, you can't do this, and this is the realm of the possible, etc. So, in that respect, A couple of things. I would say that Milton Friedman sacrificed about half of his program in compromise with the status quo. Meaning,
Which half?
well, he says, he's for free markets and for choice, giving people choice. He advocated rather than welfare, rather than using tax money to fund social programs, he instead offered a negative income tax, where you just give money to poor people to spend as they would. So rather than having to go to a bureaucracy and fulfill criteria in order to get aid, he said, if you make below a certain income, you should just get it all back. So it was a negative income tax. It was essentially free money. And he said, let the market organize what people will spend it on. That, of course, was not followed. That was not followed. So there was never a negative income tax. There was never that kind of grant to poor people. And in that respect, he didn't, in fact, serve the market. Right? In other words, he offered the market in a very partial way, ultimately. I think that his goal was to make society much more market-oriented than it has turned out to be, meaning the state still controls a great deal. It's just that the state controls more to the disadvantage of poor people than it used to. And that's what I mean when I say only half of his program was realized. And I think that that's
so
crucial.
why did this happen?
Because, of course, no one wanted to give money to poor people. Right. So, in other words, the free market is good for rich people, but not for poor people, basically. And whereas Milton Friedman wanted everyone to participate, including taxing people in such a way to boost the capacity for poor people to participate, and that didn't happen. So there's a constituency to give tax money to rich people, but not to poor people.
So would you say that...
And I think that changes his entire program.
Sure.
Yeah.
But would you say that then, because he claims he's not a conservative, he's a radical, would you say that if he had, that if you read to his program, that it would not be a conservative program? That it could be even a left-wing program?
It wouldn't be a left-wing program, it wouldn't. However...
why wouldn't it be?
Well, I would say that...
Because it would go, I'm saying this because it would go in terms of what's possible, it would change, like it would be...
It would change things.
Yeah.
Well, because I think that the market is inadequate to capitalism. Meaning it ultimately would not... It would create a problem of production and consumption. Meaning, yes, people would be able to exercise more choice over consumption, but they wouldn't, by virtue of that, be able to exercise more power over production. So in other words, it was still, his original idea was still too partial, still too one-sided. It identified freedom with
So it was a bad theory.
Yeah. It was, again, though, a discontent, meaning that for him, state-organized capitalism was a kind of crony capitalism, which he thought was unfair. In other words, he thought that rich people maintain their wealth through state sponsorship, and he thought that constrained the possibilities for society, not just for the economy, but for society in general. That's certainly true. However, he didn't look closely at why that would have been the case. In other words, I don't think that Milton Friedman really understood capitalism. In other words, how the state manages capitalism. It doesn't just manage wealth. It manages a dynamic of value. And so by looking at the state, the bureaucracy, the contracts that the state gives to capitalists, and trying to compensate for that by dissolving the bureaucracy and giving more money to the people, he was only looking at one part of it. He was looking at a kind of market versus state, as if that really sums up the problem, and I don't think that it does, because I don't think the state's the cause of the problem.
What's left off?
Well, capital accumulation. In other words, capital accumulation can take the form of state capitalism, but it can also take the form of private capitalism. And his was directed against state capitalism. It doesn't really address the problem of private accumulation.
Okay. So it's very interesting because I went. I'm trying to have a discussion with the whole spectrum. And so I went to meet some people from the Chicago School of Economics. And I was, and so there was Eugene Fama there. Like there was a big event about the legacy of the Chicago School of Economics, It was interesting because these guys were really talking like architects. I think about changing reality, but they were also acknowledging, like architects do, that they don't know what they're talking about. Because they say, we're going to reform the train system, but nobody knows how to run a train. This sort of distinction between there's a place in which you have to make calls from a top-down system with not knowing exactly how it operates. What do you see? So that was very interesting. But also, for instance, Eugene Fama was the one with having the most radical
suggestions,
and he was saying, so he was the only one about financiarization of he was the one from business and not from economics.
From the business school.
And so he was basically saying, well, you guys can deal to the others, it's sort of, anyway, this was sort of a big, more than a debate, it was a family gathering, and he was saying, you guys can deal with the sort of details about it, but we're actually changing reality. In terms of, the financialization of economy has been a rather massive change. So, and this, has this not been engineered? Has this not come from brains and?
Certainly. What I'd say though is, from my perspective as a Marxist, capitalism is not a system. What it is a crisis. It's a contradiction. So rather than being complex, what I'd say is that it's crisis-ridden and that it's disintegrative. In other words, what you have over the last 200 years is a social, political, economic crisis and a process of disintegration. And I think that in that dynamic, people try to do things to cope with it. And the way I regard all practices under capitalism are attempts at various levels and in different ways to cope with that crisis and that social disintegration. Finance is one way in which people have tried to deal with the crisis of capitalism. So the shift to financialization after the 1970s, I would say, has been an attempt to navigate the crisis of capitalism. So you do have...
Well, you would say surf it. Some people had a good ride. Okay, sorry.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah. And so certainly some people work it to their advantage. But that the reason that states would endorse this is that it seems practicable in some way. It seems pragmatic. Regardless of the fact that it has not only recently entered into crisis, but it's really throughout the period.
It's structurally a crisis, according to what you're saying.
Now, some people say that there's a pattern, a long-term pattern of alternating financialization and restructuring, in which once capital accumulates to a certain point, it's followed by a period of financialization. So that the period after 1873, leading into the 20th century, you had a period of capital accumulation that then was followed by financialization that had a crash, the Great Depression, and then that was followed by a kind of more managed accumulation, which entered into a crisis and then had financialization in the 1970s. So there is that theory that there are alternating periods of kind of state regulation and financialization following each other, sort of successively. I'm not so sure about that. There being a kind of pendulum swing dynamic at work. But that's at least one hypothesis that's been...
But that would not prevent the idea that, that would still work within the idea that people try to cope with it.
Yes.
It doesn't eject or refute the idea that it could be structurally a crisis.
Exactly. That people just alternate between the ways that they try to cope with the crisis. And so some have expected the financial crisis now to be followed by a more state-oriented, kind of managed capitalism, or a new welfare state, a new deal.
Yeah, because I think it's FDR in which during FDR the top 1% were taxed at 95%.
Yes,
and that's not a communist country.
No.
So, but if you were to just even mention the idea today, it would be it would be that's beyond social security, and
I think that The reason it wouldn't happen is not because the 1% would fight back. It's because people would think that it would choke the economy in some way. In other words, they would see that as a kind of national suicide in the global economy.
You mean the voters? Or like the people, I'm saying, like throughout society.
Throughout society, yeah, not just the voters. I would say that the bureaucrats, the various capitalist managers, academics, they would say, well, the global economy doesn't work the way it did in the 1930s. In the 1930s, you could organize the national capital through taxation in a way that now things are too globalized and you can't really do that. I don't think that that's necessarily true, but I think that that's what it would come up against. You'd get this idea that the world doesn't work that way anymore, that would be to the disadvantage of the United States relative to other countries. It would make the U.S. Less competitive.
Okay, so a couple of things here, because so when you say that basically, if you understand capitalism as being fundamentally a crisis, is there the assumption that before capitalism we were not on a crisis system? That there could have been other systems that would be less societal or like disintegrated?
Yes, I would say traditional civilization was not characterized by crisis in this way. It certainly suffered from natural disasters and warfare and things like that, which were essentially experienced as natural disasters or as divine intervention. Mm-hmm. But that's not structural crisis. That's more exogenous. It comes from outside. Whereas I understand capitalism to have a kind of intrinsic crisis. It doesn't experience external threats. It destroys itself from within. And that's new. That's different in the history of the world.
It's 200 years new.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so in that respect, I think that the question is whether humanity can respond to that crisis other than in a way of just reorganizing capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so because a couple of things have come in mind, there's this idea, if it's a crisis, there's all this talk about accelerationism today. Mm-hmm.
Like a kind of worseism.
Worseism. There are inherent contradictions, so let's just intensify them so that capitalism goes up. I have a hard time believing this because it seems like capital has been very good at making the best of its contradiction, right? But would you have something to say about accelerationism?
Well, I think that it neglects something, which is that capitalism is revolutionary. Yeah. Which means that it's also emancipatory. It is a participatory system in certain respects, meaning the way people try to cope with it, it's out of forms of discontent. Meaning once things don't work in the same way anymore, then people find other ways of making it work out of their concrete discontents. Mm-hmm. And the fact that capitalism can recapture those discontents, that the crisis can be driven by those discontents and not only, in a sense, solved or overcome by those discontents, is a formidable challenge. So I think that what we have to do is not think, okay, drive the system into a worse crisis, but rather think of, in a sense, advancing the crisis, advancing the dialectic, raising it to another level, making it more of a political issue. Rather than, in a sense, reveling in the unfreedom of it and expecting it to break down by its own accord.
Because that would be relying on the assumption that the political debate would then not be biased by money, like if someone like Donald Trump, or, and again we go back to this idea that people vote against their own interests. So, and then to the power of ideas compared to you're still hoping for that, or you still have hope on ideas and political debate?
I think that I wouldn't overplay the importance of ideas, but ideas are important. The degree to which discontents in capitalism might point beyond capitalism. In other words, we have to look at the nature of the contradiction in capitalism, the nature of the crisis in capitalism. For instance, if capitalism has survived over the course of the last 40 years, the course of the last generation, by driving down the standard of living of the working class, at the same time that it's produced new jobs, it's also cut many jobs, and there might be a net loss of jobs. In other words, not just a reordering of the kind of work that's done. Then we have to think about in that respect, driving the crisis beyond itself. Meaning, if it's a crisis of wage, labor, and capital, then perhaps we need to think beyond both categories, beyond wage, labor, beyond capital. And in that respect, I think that people have to come up against the limits of their own practices in practice. In other words, I don't think that they can do so at the level of mere ideas. So the reason that I'm still a Marxist is that I look back historically and I say, well, when was the most radical attempt to consciously change the world? And that was Marxism, almost 100 years ago. And in that respect, the idea is that the workers in pressing their demands against the capitalists would come up against their own limits as workers. In other words, they'd come up against the limits of a society organized around labor, around work. And I understand socialism to be the realization of capitalism, the possibility of going beyond work. What you've had instead, because capitalism is a crisis of wage labor, what you've had instead is a transformation of wage labor. So you have regimes of wage labor that suffer a crisis, and then wage labor gets reestablished on a different basis. Whereas, in fact, the workers would have to themselves come up against their own limits trying to organize themselves as workers in order to go beyond the system. So I don't think that kind of either ideological or technocratic solutions can really go beyond capitalism, because there will always be people willing to work as long as they need to work to live, to survive, and that will always drive the system. It will always mean that people are going to find new ways of wage laboring and reproduce the crisis of wage labor and capital. So in this respect, I think that we've been living in a kind of damnation of the last 150 years, where on the one hand, the idea of participating in society through your work is very compelling to people. On the other hand, capitalism represents a limit to that, a limit to how we, because I see it again as a form of participation.
But then, no better. We just have to make a small cut for changing battery.
Okay.
And we're moving towards the end, but there's still a couple of... So yeah. You've pointed at it, like in your last more or less answer, where you're still a Marxist, but the 11th thesis of Feuerbach, philosophers until now have mainly analyzed
interpreted the world.
Interpreted the world.
The point is to change
it.
it.
The point, however, is to change it. So, as you said, it seemed like the idea of changing the world would be, and there has been such a hope, massive hope around the world. Till the point that it actually has been violently repressed. There was, so there has been, ideas have had a role in, the shaping the way, the world in which we live now. So, what should happen in order for us to change it? And the question also is, it seems, according to what you're saying, that the bourgeois state and capitalism crisis, whatever, as a crisis, happened through a revolution.
Yeah.
So I'm claiming that we might not be totally in tune on this, but I'm claiming that Milton Friedman was also a revolution. But,
yes.
And so, can there be a revolution from the people, or does that sound as an absurd idea?
No, I don't think that it's absurd, but of course it depends on people being organized. My, own view on this is that, of course, there are periodic upsurges, popular uprisings, either massive or marginal, but still 2011 you had the Arab Spring, and you also had Occupy Wall Street, and these were popular upsurges. However, they were limited in their capacity to reorganize society. So I think that a problem is that you need organization before the revolution. And going back to the New Left, All right, so the New Left was the expression of the crisis of official communism, especially the communist parties. I think that the New Left had an aversion to political parties, to organization, based on their experience of those forms of political organization being repressive and authoritarian. And I think that we've suffered the consequences that the last 40 years there's been a kind of fear of organizing, a fear of political organizing, party political organizing. And so the right has been more successful. Now, the right does not need the kind of organizing that the left needs. Mm-hmm. It doesn't actually require that. It can rely upon the way things are already organized. It can rely on spontaneity better than the left can, in fact. But I think that we still live with...
There would be more planning to do from part of the left.
Yeah, certainly. There has to be a strategy. There has to be a program. There has to be a plan of action.
Which we don't have.
Which we don't have. No, we don't have that. And of course there are very marginal groups that might have political programs, but there isn't the kind of massive organizing of the working class that you saw in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I think that has a lot to do with intellectuals, people like me, not willing to serve as instruments of popular organization, because I think that especially intellectuals in the 1960s and later have been averse to political organizing and have kind of romanticized the spontaneity of the people and have abdicated their responsibility, which is to serve a role as instruments of popular organization. And so
why has this been again engineered, or is it's just a consequence of? I'm more interested in massive phenomena always than because we could look at X or Y individual and say, oh, he backed out or whatever. But if it's a massive phenomenon, then there must be other causes than just the sum of individuals.
That's right, and I think that we still live under the shadow of the failure of the preceding left, meaning the official left, the organized left. Its limits were revealed in the 1960s, and that's why the New Left came about. And I think that we'd have to make an argument that it doesn't have to be that way. In other words, that you could have coherent political organizing and strategy that did not serve the kind of conservative role.
I would also say that there's a fear from the top of
Sure.
inhabiting of the top down.
Yes,
because that it's always about the people. But then, one of the other reasons why this show is called After the Revolution is about the quote from Zizek, which echoes what you were saying. He was saying it's always very moving to see the uprising of people, but what counts is the day after.
Yes, absolutely, certainly. So,
and so just like to end up, this whole show is about, the fact that architecture as a top-down phenomenon is a very scary thing because, it oppresses people. But can we make the economy of a top-down system in order to escape and there's that quote that I wanted to put somewhere, because there was a very moving, there was a British writer who said recently, she received an award and said, I know it seems like capitalism is everywhere and, it's through whatever we do, but she says that so was the power of kings.
Certainly.
So you see what I'm saying? Should we go to the risk of a top-down system? Is that what we're bound to, or should we come up with alternative ways of thinking than the top-down system, which always would be bound to be associated with the oppressing of the people?
For me, I don't think that it's a matter of top-down or bottom-up. I think that capitalism is both. And therefore any attempt to overcome it would have to be both. For me, it has to do with power and responsibility. Meaning you can't really have responsibility without power, and you can't have power without responsibility. Not in any effective way. And so I think that, again, I understand it as a problem of ideological vision in the sense that there's an inhibition about taking responsibility, taking power. because taking power would mean taking responsibility, and I think that that's averse for people. So
People from the left.
people from the left, absolutely. The right has no qualms about that. Now, of course, I think that the right takes power, takes responsibility, but that the power is kind of chimerical and the responsibility is elusive. So, again, I think that they flatter themselves that they have power that they don't really have. So, for instance, the neoconservatives had a plan for Iraq that did not work. And so they neither had power over events nor did they have responsibility.
Yeah.
I think that the left is challenged to assert power and assert responsibility, to take responsibility in taking power. And that's a far more daunting task. So I think that the task of the left is greater than that of the right. And I do see it as abdication of responsibility. I do see
So
that,
how would you see someone like Bernie?
I think that Bernie Sanders, he's a independent senator for a long time, but basically is a kind of left Democrat.
Because he seemed to be associated with responsibility.
Certainly he's offering himself to take responsibility, meaning to run as a nominee for president of the United States in a major party and to run for president, to take office. He's willing to take responsibility.
But also,
Certainly.
it seems like he has been, he's not in his first age, and, he apparently has been very consistent throughout. That's what I'm told.
Yes.
He's been very consistent. In France, Sarkozy, as soon as he was not reelected, he left politics. He was
Right.
not interested anymore.
Right.
So, there seems to be like this sort of tedious, repeated work about, being a politician, like, in a sort of consistent way or something.
That's true. And I would say that the limits there...
I'm asking not to defend Bernie Sanders,
Right.
but as is he amongst a couple of figures of the left in the U.S. that would escape this phenomena that you describe as being refusing and not endorsing responsibility?
Certainly. I would say that the limits of Sanders are the limits of the Democratic Party, meaning that I think that he claims to want a political revolution. He says millions of people would have to be involved in order to really change things. But he doesn't really have a definite vision, nor does he have the organizational capacity to make that happen. In other words, what he has is the ability to perhaps win the nomination of the Democrats and perhaps win the election, in the way that Obama did, for example. He organized voters to elect himself to office. But even Obama said that without a movement, he couldn't effect the change that he wanted to effect. So I think that, again, these kinds of figures, they are willing to take responsibility. However, I don't think that the responsibility that they're taking is actually adequate to change things.
It's funny because you were the ones inventing the revolution. We just sort of copied it somehow. But then it seems like, for instance, in France today, there's a plan. Like people from, at least from the radical left, or the so-called radical left, Mélenchon claims that there would be a constituant. There would be, like going back to the revolutionary process of saying, okay, the people take power and then they assemble and they design. So he's saying, I don't have a program. It's the people who need to have a program. So would that?
That would be required.
But is that thinkable in the imaginary of this more individual? What I was thinking about, because that it's really substantiating the people.
Yes,
as a people.
That's right. Well, I think that there would be a lot of political struggle, and it would be conducted by individuals, and they would become standard bearers. They would become, exponents of different tendencies. People would have to compete in their vision. And also, there would perhaps be a division of labor among different characters in any political transformation, meaning it's not that any one party or any one individual certainly could play the instrumental role. It would have to be a variety of characters, a variety of figures, a variety of organizations involved in changing the world. And that would involve political conflict. And I think that that's also something that we fear. We fear political conflict and on the left, and the right does not. The right is willing to engage in political conflict in a way that the left is not. And the left being on the defensive has also undermined.
Is that due to some sort of guilt of what happened in Russia? Or like
certainly, yeah, certainly. The idea being that, and it goes back to the French Revolution as well, the fear of the Jacobins.
Yeah, without willing to be a conspiracy theorist myself, it seems that has been a construct that that has been overplayed.
Absolutely, and yet it's there. Right?
But that's a dominant ideological thing, much more than. So, one thing, I guess it's been more than an hour. So, one last thing I would like to ask you: why do you why do you call your blog The Last Marxist? What is the meaning of The Last Marxist?
The Last Marxist. Well, it's of course somewhat tongue-in-cheek, and it's a provocation. Meaning it raises the question of what would it mean to be the last Marxist. It isn't a claim to fame exactly. It's more like, I'm shipwrecked from this history. Because I'd say that, to try to remain true to Marxism at this late date is a peculiar kind of gesture. And so the last Marxist, meaning the Marxism that lasts. Because certainly I was, as a teenager, when I read the Communist Manifesto, the famous articulation of Marx and Engels, the famous articulation of Marxism, I was fundamentally changed in my view of the world. And I think that I've remained true to that change in a way that many people on the Marxist left are not. And so that's what the other provocation is, to say, okay, can you remain true to Marx's vision in the sense of the full vision and the dialectical vision, the contradictory vision? Because Marx saw capitalism as revolutionary and as counter-revolutionary, as a crisis but also an opportunity. In other words, he had a dialectical conception of capitalism. He also had a criticism of socialism. So a large portion of the manifesto is talking about other communists, other socialists as conservative, reactionary. And I think that ethos of willing to find the contradiction in reality and the contradiction in the attempt to change reality. Meaning capitalism is contradictory and any attempt to change it is contradictory. To embrace that contradiction, I think that that's something that is unique to Marx and unique to the movement that he inspired, but that has been lost. So I think that now people have a kind of undialectical view of capitalism. They think of capitalism as bad. They see it as a crisis only in a one-sided way. They don't see it as an opportunity. They don't see it in its potential and possibility. They see it only in its negative consequences. And I think that really inhibits their ability to engage it and to change the world.
But would that echo, isn't what we call social democracy is sort of embracing it seems like, at least in Europe, most of the left is swamped in this idea that, you would not try to come up with an alternative system of capitalism. You would sort of try to make it decent.
Make it decent. Well, of course, I think that that's an illusion, meaning I think, like we were talking about earlier, any attempt to cope with the crisis of capitalism, in fact, drives that crisis of capitalism. So you might think that you are mitigating it or attenuating it, or controlling it in some way. In fact, you're just shifting it into another domain. And so that's why I don't think that the crisis is only economic. I think that it's also cultural, political, social. It gets expressed in many ways, and when you think that you've solved it in one domain, it pops up in another domain. And so, again, the idea of managing capitalism, which is what the right does, after all, I think is an illusion. And I think that it can appear to solve the problem, but in fact it continues to drive the problem.
So how would you still say within in this intention of from your part to be truly embracing the contradiction of capitalism as being partly like a positive or revolutionary system? What would you see that would dare to be kept, or that would be there to be
used in some way? Again, I think that the fact that capitalism drives people into wage labor and continues to drive people into wage labor, so that people who were once peasants are now driven into wage labor, or people who are outside of the wage labor economy, like women, are driven into wage labor in various parts of the world, and that work is changed at the concrete level. I think that that's an opportunity. In other words, just anecdotally, when I first lived in Chicago, there was a campaign to keep Walmart out of Chicago because Walmart is seen as, hostile to the working class, hostile to unions, it's low wages, etc. Whereas I thought, no, we should bring Walmart to Chicago and then organize the workers at Walmart. And that's how you do it.
Walmart.
Exactly. Or how you engage capitalism, right? And so I saw it at Walmart, as an opportunity, not as just as a negative force. And similarly with globalization. So in the 1990s, there was a kind of anti-globalization movement or alter-globalization movement. I think that globalized capitalism is an opportunity. It's also massively destructive, but it's also an opportunity for people to organize as wage laborers, as workers, and that therefore that has to be taken advantage of. I don't think that we should protect peasants from becoming exploited by capitalism, because I think that being exploited by capitalism is a political opportunity for people that would not exist if they remained peasants.
Okay.
So that's the kind of one way of approaching it.
I can see that, but it's very much along the lines of what I'm trying to do also, so I can find my ground on this. Thank you very much, Chris. That was very dense, and I'm gonna have a hard time chopping this into 30 minutes again. But there will be a link to the full version of it too. So thank you. Tune in soon. There will be more. Cut.